fuck's sake.
Why is it that every time I get a AAA mainstream game that just so happens to be attached to one of my favorite intellectual properties in entertainment, I feel like I have to brace for impact?
I hate manure!
Boys, did I walk into the wrong neighborhood when I acquired this game? Or was it Obsidian who came to the wrong neighborhood when they created and marketed Avowed as an RPG that takes place in the universe of Pillars of Eternity? Clearly they didn't expect to sell this game to us RPG freaks, to us old-time Infinity Engine lovers, to those of us who saw the rebirth of the isometric medieval fantasy CRPG in the original Pillars of Eternity. Did they make this game for the uber casual guy or gal who picks the games he plays almost exclusively from the AAA shelf? For some dude who goes from an FPS to an action game to an RPG depending on what's the hottest title at the time? If that's the case, then why did they make Avowed to take place in the Pillars of Eternity universe? To those people I mentioned, the Pillars of Eternity brand matters less than shit. I bet half of them don't even know Avowed is a Pillars of Eternity game. Were they expecting to bring new fans to the IP? Then why would they want to piss off a good chunk of the core fans of the IP by purging every feature and mechanic that got the OG fan interested in the brand in the first place? Were they perhaps hoping that a good portion of the OG fan base would simply not mind too much of these changes? I don't fucking know. I don't know the answers to any of these questions, but I do know this. This is the last straw for me. These series are dead to me. And I'm not talking just about Pillars of Eternity. The mentality and the ideas of those who are in the driver's seat of my former favorite intellectual properties in gaming are just too different from mine. And set mentality trickles into every aspect of their games, making them almost insufferable to me. And let's see why.
Brace yourself. We're going to pin this bastard down.
Welcome to Ye Olde Entertainment. My name is Alex, and as you know, it is my duty, my mission, my purpose in life to help you decide whether that game that you have been plucking daisies about for so long is indeed the right game for you or not. And as some of you also know, I use a system of categories that I think are relevant to the genre of the game at hand. And the game at hand today is Avowed, an action game with RPG elements and real-time combat, which takes place in the Pillars of Eternity universe. But it has been given the label of RPG, so that's how we are going to treat it. And when it comes to those, character creation and character progression are up first. Pillars of Eternity's character creation screen was a bit of a dream come true for those of us who longed for the glory days of those timeless classics that were made with the Infinity Engine, most notably Baldur's Gate 2. In Pillars of Eternity, you could choose your character's race from a typical assortment of fantasy races like humans, dwarves, and elves. Tropey, yes, but you also had interesting lore-specific races like the Orlan, the Amawa, and the Godlike. There were even sub-races for you to take your role-playing further. Dwarves, for example, could be boreal dwarves or mountain dwarves. This choice wasn't too impactful, but it wasn't merely cosmetic either. Boreal dwarves got a 15 accuracy bonus against wilders and primordials, while mountain dwarves had a plus 20 bonus to defense against poison. And there were also a few sub-race specific dialogue lines and party banter. Hearth Orlans and Wild Orlans, for example, were specially different from each other. They had vastly different cultural backgrounds, and they were treated differently by many of the game's NPCs. Humans even had 3 different sub-races in both of the original Pillars games. Godlikes were regular folk in the sense that they were born human, dwarf, elf, etc., but they were blessed by one of the gods in the game's lore, so they had special physical features and talents. Those people who were blessed by the god Galawain in particular were called Nature Godlike, and you had this passage in their description. Nature Godlike appeared to be a fusion of kith and animal features, often covered by plants, moss, or fungi. This has led to the common stigma that they are deceased, and many are killed at birth because of it. Keep this in mind because it'll be important later, or don't. I'll remind you when the time comes, much like Avowed does with every fucking thing. But speaking of Avowed, you don't have races in Avowed. This very simple, very standard feature of the RPG experience which Pillars of Eternity in particular did so well, is completely absent in Avowed. The excuse, and I think it's more an excuse than a reason, is that the main character in Avowed is an Idarian envoy who is a nature godlike, and the fact that he or she is a nature godlike is crucial to the story. I personally think this argument is shit. If you are going to make an RPG, especially if it takes place in the universe of Pillars of Eternity, a series of games that were famous for giving players the option of playing as 6 different races, each of which had at least 2 different variants, your story can never come at the expense of the player not being able to choose his or her race. In Pillars of Eternity and Pillars of Eternity 2, you also had 11 classes to choose from: Barbarian, Druid, Fighter, Monk, Paladin, Priest, Ranger, Rogue, and Wizard, all of which were very similar to their D&D counterparts. But you also had Chanters, which were somewhat similar to Bards in D&D, but were much more focused on summoning, and you had the Cypher class, which was a super interesting lore-specific class that you had in Pillars of Eternity. These classes had their own array of abilities and talents with which you could hone your character to the role you wanted him or her to play in the party. A tank, a healer, a damage specialist, a crowd control specialist, etc. Some of these classes also had subclasses in Pillars, and all of them had in Pillars of Eternity too. Paladins in both games could belong to different orders, like the Shield Bearers of St. Helga, the Kind Wayfarers, the Goldpack Knights, the Darkosi Paladini, or the Bleak Walkers. In Pillars of Eternity 2, archetypes had strengths and weaknesses, as well as subclass-specific talents in some cases, and all of them served to further tune your character towards your specialty of choice. There were even subclass-specific conversations in these games. In the first Pillars of Eternity, you couldn't multi-class, but over the course of the game, when you leveled, you were given the choice of learning lesser versions of some of the other classes' abilities instead of a full strength ability of your own class. And I think this was pretty cool, because if you were a paladin and you wanted to take on the role of a tank, there were a few fighter and barbarian talents, for example, that were more useful to a tank, even in their lesser forms, than some of the paladin's own talents. In Pillars of Eternity 2, you could multi-class, which means that you could choose 2 classes and their respective subclasses. And if you knew what you wanted your character to be, you could choose just the right abilities, skills, items, and enhancements that would make him or her a perfect tank, healer, damage specialist, crowd control specialist, or support specialist. I was especially proud of a custom-made fighter paladin character that I created. Not as a main character, but as a companion. And creating your own companions was a thing that you could do in the original Pillars games, by the way. This guy was my party's tank, and he was basically unkillable. Well, in Avowed, you don't choose a class.
I'm sorry, what?
Nope, you don't. Every character you create has access to the same 3 ability tabs: Fighter, Ranger, and Wizard.
Wow.
You have a Godlike tab too, but that one doesn't really count, because your godlike abilities get added through story events and you don't get a choice in the matter. And I loathe the abilities that get added to your godlike tab. To me, they feel like an anti-failure safety net. There is a healing spell, for example, that you can cast, even if your build doesn't have an ounce of magic in it.
But come on, Alex.
I hear you say.
Avowed takes place in the Pillars of Eternity universe, but that's just the theme. The game itself is not a Pillars of Eternity game. It's more a first-person RPG with real-time combat. Something along the lines of the post-Daggerfall Elder Scrolls games, like Skyrim, for example. And let's be honest, in many games that are truly comparable to Avowed, you don't choose a class either.
Well observed, strawman that I used to get my point across. But in all those other games, there are mechanics that serve to narrow down the array of options at your disposal so that you choose the ones that best serve your approach to the game. I have been playing Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon lately, and in that game you get to choose between different archetypes that are clearly geared towards certain playstyles. And then you have various skill trees that you can use to either broaden the spectrum of things that your character can utilize in combat, or to further specialize in the things that you have chosen as the bread and butter of your tactics. Skyrim has a slew of talent trees, and they are not locked to a class system. But in order to unlock the last talent in any branch, you must have unlocked all previous talents, and that requires the player to commit a lot of skill points. The result is that most talents in most talent trees are going to remain unused, because you just won't have enough skill points to master everything. In Titan quests, you don't choose a class at the beginning of the game, but over the course of the game you choose 2 specialties, which means that talents from other specialties are off the table. And also you need to focus on those talent trees that are relevant to your build. And in order to unlock the last talent in any branch, you need to have unlocked the previous one. Avowed's 3 tabs are not only not mutually exclusive, but you can acquire most skills without restrictions so long as your character has the right level. Which means that the concept of opportunity cost, which is inherent to talent trees, and to the very concept of choice, is reduced to a minimum in Avowed's character progression system. Not being able to choose your race or your class in the game goes well beyond Obsidian being merely lazy. I think laziness might have had something to do with it, but I think they were deliberately trying to avoid the inclusion of any mechanics that would involve some form of trade-off. And I think the difference between how abilities were designed in Pillars of Eternity and the way in which they were designed in Avowed illustrates this perfectly. Let's compare the way in which Into the Fray works in Pillars of Eternity 2 with the way in which it works in Avowed. In both games, this ability allows you to pull enemies away from an ally and into immediate melee range. In Pillars of Eternity 2, it also causes crush damage and it leaves enemies dazed. But more importantly, this ability had 2 mutually exclusive variants in Pillars of Eternity 2. You had the Lower Their Guard variant, which lowered the enemy's armor rating, or the Out of the Fire variant, which made the skill usable on allies without harming them. But you had to choose. You had to have one or the other, which was fine, because you had to choose the variant that was more useful to you depending on your character's build. In Avowed, this ability doesn't do crush damage and it doesn't leave enemies dazed, but more importantly, it has 3 levels. The first one simply unlocks the ability, but the other 2 are upgrades that get added to the ability. They are not mutually exclusive. Another thing that you had in Pillars of Eternity that you don't have in Avowed is skills. I think the concept of skills is at the very heart of the RPG experience. Athletics, survival, diplomacy, mechanics, bluff, streetwise, religion. These things mattered in the world of Pillars of Eternity. In both Pillars games, there were plenty of skill checks both in dialogue and in scripted interactions, and you could pass or fail these skill checks, and failing a skill check could sometimes have disastrous consequences. Consequences that sometimes had long-term implications. At the very beginning of the game in Pillars of Eternity, if you didn't pass a skill check in one of the game's first scripted events, you could end up losing one of your early game companions, no less. Take Underrail, for example. If you wanted to become an ace hacker, no matter how you played the game, mastering hacking inevitably came at the expense of mastery in something else, like lockpicking or explosives. Which meant that if you focused on hacking, you were able to hack every computer, robot, door, and terminal that could be hacked. But the trade-off was that there were some doors that you couldn't be able to lockpick, and or some stuff that you weren't able to blow up. But that's why the rewards that you got from beating some of the game's hardest hacking challenges were so freaking good, and it's also why they felt deserved. Beating the hardest hacking challenges felt more like a true achievement, because you had to sacrifice not being able to lockpick many of the game's doors and containers. Bottom line here is that opportunity cost is necessary in RPGs.
No pressure, no diamonds.
Indie developers like Iron Tower understand this. That's why their character creation systems are beautiful. That's why everything you accomplish in their games feels like an achievement, and that's why their games are worth playing more than once. But skills aren't a thing in Avowed. The concept just doesn't even exist. In Pillars and Pillars 2, players could also choose their culture of origin, and it made all the sense in the world. The world of Pillars of Eternity has one of the most elaborate and interesting lores that I've seen in a game. Aspects such as religion, history, geography, ethnicity, and idiosyncrasy are intricate and robust in the world of Pillars of Eternity, and your choice of culture went beyond the typical plus X constitution or plus Y dexterity bonus. The world had something to say about your place of origin. Kana, for example, had several dialogue lines that were specific to your Rawatayan origin. If you were Rawatayan, of course. In Avowed, you are an Ideiran envoy, and that's that. Problem solved, I guess. Obsidian didn't have to bother with the ifs of the main character's origin, because why would they write stories and conversations and have the voice actor record dialogue lines that only those who choose to play as Rawatayan or Valian would hear? And worst yet, putting the player through the sacrifice of missing out on some dialogue lines and quests only because they didn't choose a certain origin? Perish the thought. In Pillars of Eternity, you had 25 different backgrounds, and in Pillars of Eternity 2, you had 17. And they also depended on your culture of origin. If you were Rawatayan, for example, you could choose to play as an escaped slave, but you couldn't be a colonist, for example. If you played as someone from the Living Lands, the opposite was true. Backgrounds came with different skill bonuses, but also the world acknowledged your background. Very early on in the game, in Pillars of Eternity, Kalisha had something to say about you being a mercenary or a slave or whatnot. Same thing in Pillars 2. Some of the conversations you had with Seraphine were specific to your slave origin. If you were a slave, of course. In Avowed, you have 5 backgrounds, and you almost always have a background-specific dialogue choice during conversations, but it means jack shit. Some NPCs and some companions have special answers for your origin-specific dialogue lines, but if the developers are going to give us 5 backgrounds, then I expect to have background-specific quests, items, romances, and even locations. But that, of course, is not the case because Obsidian needs to level the playing field. Why would people who've made certain choices at the character creation screen be kept from experiencing some of the game's locations, dialogues, and outcomes? You have attribute points in Avowed, just as you do in Pillars, but you cannot increase any of them higher than 3 at the character creation screen, so you can forget about min-maxing. Also, when you level, you sometimes get an extra point to allocate to the attribute of your choice. And when you do, what you get is a percentage increment to those stats that are governed by said attribute, and that's it. Obviously, since skills aren't a thing in the game, these attributes don't add modifiers to skill checks. Sometimes you get dialogue options that have a minimum attribute requirement, but I didn't feel like they had any significant impact in conversations. One thing that you have plenty of in Avowed compared to Pillars of Eternity and Pillars of Eternity 2 is cosmetic options. You know, I often hear shit along the lines of,
"Get the message, this game is not for you. It was never meant for you in the first place."
well, you can't choose a race, you can't choose a class, you can't choose a culture of origin, and archetypes and skills aren't a thing. But you have a tab of extra features with separate tabs for eyeliner, makeup, lips. Yep, the game is clearly not for me. I get it. You know what other game isn't for me? Inzoi. But I'm not going to touch that shit with a 10-foot pole because it's not an RPG that takes place in the universe of Pillars of Eternity. So don't worry when I see the option of heterochromia for your eyes and of course the choice of pronouns. The message is loud and clear. Doesn't mean I'm going to shut up about me not liking it, does it? Some content creators have revealed that there was a partial embargo on the game before it got released, meaning that there were aspects of the game that they weren't allowed to show. And one of those aspects was the character creation screen. I wonder if the lack of some of the most basic features that people expect to see in a Pillars of Eternity based RPG, like races, classes, subclasses, cultures, and backgrounds, and the inclusion of features that only an infinitesimal part of the audience asked for had anything to do with that. If I had to venture a guess, my hypothesis would be that the developers didn't want to reveal the character creation interface because they absolutely knew a good chunk of the core fanbase was going to hate it. And if my hypothesis is right, then it's an act of bad faith devised by someone who loathes a part of its game consumer base but still wants to take their money. Or perhaps they did it because they thought it would open the gate for haters to influence others with their negativity. That shit doesn't happen, by the way. It doesn't work that way, just so you know. But that's a different story. But let's try to be charitable and fair to Avowed for a moment. One thing that we have repeated constantly over the course of the years here on the channel is that the character progression system is only as good as the freedom it gives players to experience every aspect of the gameplay in their own way. And you could say that so far we have been unfair to Avowed, because we have been comparing it to Pillars of Eternity, when Avowed isn't an isometric CRPG gameplay-wise. It isn't trying to be a Pillars of Eternity game. So of course its character creation screen and its progression system are going to be nothing like the ones in Pillars of Eternity. In Avowed you don't have the athletic skill, for example, because it wouldn't make sense. In this game you get around by walking, running, swimming, jumping, and by using the game's parkour system. You don't have a skill like survival, because all the things that you get from the survival skill in Pillars of Eternity are broken up and spread across various features and mechanics that you could say befit a game with real-time combat and exploration. Yup, second wind is something that happens automatically, because why burden the player with the need to time the skill correctly? And that might all be true. But then we would need to compare Avowed with other first-person RPGs with real-time combat. Games like Morrowind, Oblivion, and Skyrim from the Elder Scrolls series, or Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. And in all those other games, skills are still very much a thing. You have lockpicking in those games, just as you do in Avowed, but in all those other games, there is a lockpicking skill, and it determines how efficient you are at lockpicking. And that in turn has an impact on how many lockpicks you use every time you attempt to pick a lock. In Avowed, lockpicking does not depend on your character's level of anything. You either have enough lockpicks in your inventory to open a chest, or you don't. In those other games, stealth sometimes offers a very viable alternative to combat, and whether or not you can successfully sneak around depends on your stealth level. In Avowed, stealth is marginally useful compared to those other games, and it also does not depend on your character's level of anything. There is no being better or worse at it. Everyone is equally good at it because there is no stealth skill. In all those other games, pickpocketing is a thing.
Worthy of your loyalty in the coming days.
Got a pickpocket here. Why, you dirty little
That's it.
thief.
And its efficiency is determined by your pickpocketing skill. But pickpocketing isn't even a thing in Avowed. And let's not even get into the crafting aspect of the game. We're going to leave that for later, but spoiler alert, you are just capable of crafting everything from the get-go. No need to acquire a skill, or a recipe, or to train in this, that, or the other specialty. The scenario of being unable to craft something because you don't know how has been completely removed from the game, as of course the feeling of accomplishment that you get in other similar games from finding that rare recipe or from mastering a crafting discipline after hours of hard work. I am really struggling to find a game that's even remotely comparable to Avowed that features a less impactful character progression system. Some reviewers have labeled Avowed an immersive sim. And that takes me back to the OG Deus Ex, which came out 25 years ago. A game in which if you had a good enough level of swimming, for example, you could move around some of the game's locations by diving into underground waterways and swimming from Area A to Area B undetected. And you felt good about it. Not only because you discovered that using waterways to move around was a thing in the game, but because you invested your hard-earned skill points in swimming, and you knew that if you hadn't put those points into swimming, you would have not been able to move around through these waterways. Also, every time you couldn't hack a computer or pick a lock, you were okay with it, because you took it as part of the cost of favoring some other skill, like swimming. Swimming is a thing in Avowed, by the way, and you can discover some interesting non-mandatory locations by taking a deep dive in some of the game's waterways. But there is no swimming skill in the game, of course, which basically means that all those locations that you gain access to by swimming are available to everyone. There is nothing reserved for those who commit to swimming. because committing to swimming isn't a thing in Avowed. In fact, committing to something and being rewarded for it is something that does not happen in Avowed. The only thing that might differentiate your experience from someone else's in Avowed in regards to the decisions you make pertaining your character's progression is combat. And even that only boils down to which tactic you are going to employ to tank and spank your enemies. Forget about luring enemies through long corridors to a choke point where the rest of your buddies wait in ambush. Forget about kiting enemies while your companions focus fire on the one guy who needs to die first. Forget about breaking your party into two and doing a pincer move because the two creatures that need to die first are on opposite ends of the battlefield, and they need to die simultaneously. These tactics are not only not needed, but also not even possible in Avowed. So naturally, these things will not affect your decision-making process when you are choosing a new ability. Putting together a build in Avowed is insultingly simplistic and boring. Even in Dishonored, the way you played the game changed dramatically depending on the skills you favored. With the rat summoning skill, for example, you could even circumvent combat altogether, but using this skill had such a monumental impact that it even affected the final outcome of the game. I think there is a very good reason why the devs put an embargo on Avowed's character creation and the progression system. It's disappointing compared to an average first-person open-world RPG, or even an immersive sim, and is shameful when compared to Pillars of Eternity's system. Guys, I think that this might just be the worst character creation and progression system that we have reviewed here on the channel so far. Gameplay. Despite what this guy says, Graven's strength lies precisely in the fact that it 100% knows what it is. Even if some people don't get it, it's about figuring out that in order to get to the top room in this mansion, you have to jump to the elevator's roof and then activate it. It's about figuring out that in order to be able to leave this area, you have to freeze the water so that you can make it on time before this gate closes. It's about figuring out that you not only need to use your lightning spell to activate the mechanism that opens these gates, but you also have to use your ice spell to freeze it in place, so that the gates do not close immediately after you've activated the mechanism. It's about figuring out that these pesky zigzaggy motherfuckers become sitting ducks if you shock them in place first. It's about figuring out that your fire spell is a heck of a lot more efficient if you put an exploding barrel in a choke point and then use the fire spell to blow it up when the bad guys are upon you. In Graven, players are supposed to overcome the game's challenges by figuring them out, not by pew-pew-pewing them like you do in your average first-person shooter. Slipgate Ironworks and 3D Realms really knew the game they wanted to make, and that's why they borrowed different mechanics from different genres to make a game that is all about figuring out stuff. I would love to say that Avowed is the exact opposite thing. I would love to say that it sits somewhere in between a Pillars of Eternity game, an immersive sim, and a first-person RPG along the lines of Morrowind, and that it fails spectacularly to tick the boxes of the stuff that I personally want to see in any of these genres because it doesn't know what it is. But the thing is that Avowed knows exactly what it wants to be, because it knows exactly who it wants to be for.
Get the message, this game isn't for you.
There is one thing that is very consistent in Avowed all the way through. One thing that you can see in all of its mechanics, design choices, and concepts. And it's the want to level the playing field for everyone. And this is how it works.
Oh yeah, I'll tell you something.
Watch out. Pressure plates on the floor.
Understand when I say that something.
Is that a door?
It feels as though there was someone in the development team whose job was to ask,
Well, but what happens if a player doesn't know that?
every time someone in the team came up with a mechanic or a design choice that remotely needed the player to know some of the fundamentals of the genre. Oh, there's a quest item in this location. What happens if the player doesn't find it? Well, let's add a visual cue, a sound cue, and just in case this isn't enough, Let's have their companions mention that there is a quest item in the room. Oh, there are many crates, barrels, and other types of containers lying about. What happens if the player doesn't know they're breakable? Well, we put one big fat icon there indicating that it is breakable. What happens if a player is unfamiliar with the concept of a build? Don't worry, the player doesn't need to know about builds to win the game, even in the hardest difficulty. What he can't overcome with knowledge of builds, he can always overcome by brute forcing his way through the challenge or relying on his thumb-eye coordination and trial and error. What happens if a player can't figure out that Magran's fire and Rimergan's eyes can be shot down and used to burn stuff or freeze water? What happens if he or she doesn't know that vines need to be burned if you want to get through them? What happens if he never figures out that his companion Kai has a skill that can do the trick? Don't worry, we will have companions explain everything. And we will even be detailed in the explanation of every task so that the player not only knows what to do, but also how to do it. What happens if a player doesn't know how to build a party? What happens if he doesn't know that party members are meant to fulfill different roles? My god, what happens if players don't know how to make their talents, items, and ranks in the party formation work as part of a strategy? Don't worry, we'll make it so that party builds aren't a thing in the game, and we will design combat encounters and companions so that the player doesn't need to know about tanking, healing, DPS, crowd control, nor any of these other RPG-specific mechanics. Those who know about builds will still have the choice of making items, skills, and attributes work in synergy to make their character more efficient, but those who don't know about these things will never fall too far behind. Yup, gotta level that playing field. What happens if a player skipped a dialogue line, or wasn't paying attention, or is bad with directions? What happens if he doesn't know what to do in a quest? Don't worry, we'll have his companions summarize the conversation, tell him where to go and what to do next, and we'll show a big fat quest marker in the minimap and the area map. It seems like the devs were terrified of the prospect of a player not being able to figure out what to do or how to do it or where to go. It seems like they were all hell-bent on leveling the playing field so that those who are not familiar at all with RPGs never fall too far behind those who have more experience. Unfortunately, in doing so, they made the game bland, trivial, shallow, and extremely hand-holdy for those who are into the RPG genre. The result is that every aspect of the gameplay in Avowed is either insanely hand-holdy, ridiculously easy, or both of these things. Avowed's gameplay mix consists of combat, exploration, questing, and, according to some, puzzle solving. But after finishing the game, I didn't remember solving any puzzle, so I perused the internet to see if I had missed out on something, and nope, I didn't miss anything. This is what the journos, cause that's where I got this from, consider a puzzle in this game. I will let you decide if it is.
Nothing like a win with a good team.
Charge it up. A little power goes a long way.
Let's talk about the combat now. I'd be lying to you if I told you that I didn't have any fun with the combat in Avowed. I started playing the game in the normal difficulty, but after I got a certain item and unlocked a couple of skills that synergized with it incredibly well, the game became a non-challenge, so I switched over to the Path of the Damned difficulty, and that's where the game's combat started to make sense. I went with an arquebus build for the most part, and in the hardest difficulty level, at least I was required to pull enemies away from their groups, at least I needed to dust off some of my old Wolfenstein tactics, and at least I had to factor in the level layout to make the most out of my build. Make no mistake about it though, this game will not challenge your tactical capabilities in any significant way. The only thing that you need to keep an eye out for is enemies that heal other enemies, and enemies that summon minions. That's it, there's nothing else. The rest is a mechanical yet easy thumb-eye coordination test. And if even a clumsy old fart like me aced this game in the hardest difficulty level, I imagine your average Asian teenager is going to do pornographic things to the enemies in this game. The enemy variety is also not great for a game this long, and there aren't any cool situations that involve combat like holding the line, trying to fend off enemy invaders, or infiltrating a facility, or taking the fight to the bad guys in an all-out epic assault. These missions that I am showing right now were the closest that you got to that. One was supposed to be a daring escape, and the other one an infiltration mission, but they didn't really feel like it. And most combat encounters are not related to your story-driven objectives, and for a game that heavily leans into its story, this is not great. There are, however, some encounters with story-related stakes, and those of course are the most exciting of them. There are bounty missions in every settlement, and they are very similar to the ones in the original Pillars of Eternity games. And they are okay. Ridiculously easy compared to the ones in Pillars, but okay. The enemy and friendly AI can be atrocious at times. Enemies backing away from your followers while leaving their backs exposed to you is a common occurrence in Avowed, and one that you can easily exploit, as you might imagine. Enemies that don't go beyond a certain area, allowing you to cheese them from a distance, are also not that rare. But while I had fun, more or less consistently with Avowed's combat, I wouldn't say it stands out in the crowd, not in the slightest. Kingdoms of Amalur, Tainted Grail, The Fall of Avalon, and even the Elder Scrolls games post-Daggerfall featured more rewarding combat, even with all their clunkiness. Then there is questing. I've always said that questing in a video game is only as good as the writing in the game. A good writer can turn a standard fetch quest into a memorable experience. A bad writer, on the other hand, can turn a thrilling infiltration mission into a predictable bore. And I know that I always bring up the example of Ophrah's quest in Pillars of Eternity, but I think this example is more relevant now than it's ever been. See, in the original Pillars of Eternity, Ophrah asks you to go to Anslok's Compass, a treacherous, inhospitable place by the shore of the Deerwood, where the renowned healer and midwife Ranga is said to have self-exiled to. Ophrah desperately asks you to get some form of concoction that would prevent her baby from being born hollow. This quest is brilliant in its simplicity. It's an intimate story that illustrates in a very powerful way what the Hollowborn crisis means to the people of the Deerwood and how it affects their daily lives. It shows how deadly scared of Whitewind's legacy people are, and it illustrates how easy it is for people to cling to false hope and for unscrupulous individuals to take advantage of them. Also, the reasons why Ranga is no longer living in Gilded Vale strengthen the picture of how dire things have become in the Deerwood because of Whitewind's legacy. And there are a few quests in Avowed that are somewhat similar, especially those that have to do with Animancy, your companion Jata, or the settlement of Fior Mesiverno, which is probably the most interesting place in the game as far as story and lore goes. But for the most part, the story treats players like they are mentally deficient. It over-explains things, it wipes its ass with the concept of subtext, and rubs your nose in every point it seeks to make. It also reiterates over shit that has already been established several times, because the writers needed to make sure that you understood what was going on. And it doesn't help that your companions are like walking tooltips that make you feel like you've never left the tutorial area. And every time you are given a quest, you are told where to go, what to do, and how. And there is a big fat quest marker on your map telling you where to go, just in case. Avowed is also fond of telling you, whenever there's a moral choice, what the right thing to do is. The game almost always takes sides, it almost always presents one option as unequivocally evil and the other one as unequivocally good. It's generally lacking nuance, and the bad guys almost never have a decent point to support their position. And when they do, they have evil voice acting. Also, the game isn't exactly big on foreshadowing. They are more about bluntly telling you what you are going to find. The hinting is so heavy-handed that every time you uncover something that is supposed to be a revelation, you have already seen it coming from a mile away ages ago. Like this quest in which you are supposed to find the missing members of an expedition team. At some point early on in the quest, you talk to an Aothasian oracle, and within the first seconds of conversation, you can already tell that the missing expedition members are dead and that this guy killed them. There is no need to investigate any further, but you still have to because plot. And of course you have your companion piecing together the picture for you every time you find a new piece of evidence, just in case. Or this quest, in which you are supposed to retrieve a series of books from a library that has been overrun by dream thralls. Once you recover the books, you are given the option of giving them to Elder Grigore, who is obviously the good guy here, or to Novice Dalna, who quite clearly has a self-serving agenda of some sort. This quest is intertwined with a bigger conspiracy, and I find it funny that you are supposed to be shocked when you learned that Dalna was involved. Bottom line is, I wasn't impressed with most of the quests in Avowed. You do have to give credit, however, to Obsidian for one thing. The game has an approach to quest design that is very similar to the one in Fallout New Vegas, in the sense that you don't need to follow a linear succession of steps to complete a quest. In Avowed, you can roam around freely, and that means that you can run into any NPC that is involved with a quest at any given time. Much as it happens in Fallout New Vegas, the steps of a quest change depending on which NPC you run into first. And this is pretty cool, and it does add some replay value to the questing aspect of the game. Exploration, in my opinion, is where this game truly shines. But one of you over on Discord kinda spoiled the fun for me with this aspect of the game when you asked, would you say it's as good as the one in Elden Ring? I originally didn't know how to answer that, but now that I've given it some thought...
To me, the answer is clear.
Ugh, fuck no. Exploration in Avowed is great, but it does have the same problem as every other aspect of the game. It tells the player,
I wanna hold your hand.
It pretty much points in the direction of every nook and cranny that's worth exploring. And when you venture into any of these explorable areas, you always see these very obvious breadcrumbs that you are supposed to follow, like vines that you can burn, walls that you can break, or water that you can freeze. There's a Rimmergon's eye hanging from that cave ceiling. I wonder if I have to shoot it down to freeze the water below so that I can use it as a platform. Exploration in Elden Ring was a matter of emergent gameplay. In Avowed, it is more a matter of finding the initial breadcrumb of an explorable location, but there is still an interesting feeling of adventure and discovery. But you do have to turn every exploration aid off in the options menu to be able to enjoy this aspect of the game, because the game wants to hold your hand really fucking badly. The game does, however, reward your exploration endeavors in an interesting way. There are different altars of different gods that you can find while you're out there roaming around the lands. You can activate these altars at your camp, and they give you different boons. These altars and what they do are consistent with Pillars of Eternity lore, so kudos to whomever designed them. But there are also additional pieces that you can socket into them that unlock additional bonuses. And you have to go well off the beaten trail to find them, so there is that. It also has to be said that both the area map and the minimap are pretty good, and filled with markers of all types, of course. As others have pointed out, Avowed is a game that does not give two shits about what you do beyond story decisions.
I won't forget your mercy.
There is zero reactivity to the player's actions. You can steal shit right in front of its owner without any consequences. And it seems like every NPC and a good part of the animals that you run into in the game are essential because they cannot be killed. Also, NPCs don't have day-night cycles as they do in some of the older games of the genre. Hell, they don't even move around at all. Like, ever. The only one who reacts to you stealing shit right in front of her nose is Yahtzee when you loot her backpack. And even then, it only happens once and her reaction doesn't go beyond a single dialogue line. In games like Skyrim, Oblivion, and even Morrowind, you could go to jail for attacking folks or for getting caught stealing their belongings or pickpocketing their purses. You could even go to jail for selling stolen goods. In fact, breaking out of jail after getting caught was one of the most fun things that you could do in Skyrim. None of that is a thing in Avowed. All in all, I found Avowed to be decently fun while I was out there exploring and killing shit, but painfully boring when you were back at the city handing in quests and taking up new ones. Also, the lack of the most basic reactivity from the NPCs sinks it down pretty badly, especially because some of the games that feature these mechanics have been around for ages. I wouldn't say playing Avowed was an atrocious experience at any point, but it was very far from ever being memorable. And for a title that takes place in the Pillars of Eternity universe, this is tremendously disappointing. Story and lore. One good thing that I can say about Avowed is that it's not trying to screw the building around the light bulb to make the story work. The story in Avowed isn't great, and we are going to get into that, but at least it was built upon the IP's existing lore. The characters in the game, the locations, the conflicts and rivalries between the different factions, the role of animancy and its polarizing nature, the so-called gods of Eora. The way in which all of these things are depicted in Avowed is consistent with the lore of Pillars of Eternity. The story in the game feels organic to the game's locations, history, and people. Avowed feels like a game in which the writers took into account the game's lore from the get-go. They used the game's lore as the building blocks for their characters, locations, and for the plot of the story, which is good. Perhaps this is because most of them were involved with Pillars of Eternity 2 as well. In some other games and movies that were meant to be new entries for renowned IPs, you can tell that the writers, who had very little knowledge or understanding of the IP's lore, came up with a story they wanted to tell first, and only then took an interest in the IP's original lore to see how they could retrofit their story to make it work as an entry to the series. And you can easily tell when the writers had to reverse engineer their story to make it work as an entry to the series that they're working with. The crowbarred characters, items, locations, and other iconic visual references of the original IP is usually a dead giveaway. They are usually an indication that writers feel the need to legitimize their creations with the inclusion of these things. In Avowed, you have one or two characters that have been brought over from the OG games. The main antagonist, for example, Inquisitor Ludwig, was a judge in the court of Boudica in Pillars of Eternity 2, but she was an obscure NPC that you found in the Oathbinder's Sanctum, and the quest that had to do with her wasn't even mandatory. You also have the cartographer Sansa, but these characters don't feel like they are there to say, "Hey everyone, I'm here to remind you that this is a Pillars of Eternity game." The game feels authentic in this respect. The Steel Garrote, for example, is an antagonistic faction in Avowed, and the fact that they are a paladin order dedicated to Boudica, which was founded in Aedir, along with the fact that they are usually employed by the Aediran Empire as guns for hire, is very significant to the story. The Valians in Avowed are still an expansionist republic that thrived on technological advancement and animancy, while the Rawatayans are mostly Amawa, and they are all about their military discipline. There's even a quest about a soul twin in Avowed, which is very similar to that quest we had in the White March expansion pack in the original Pillars game. Places like Castol's Folly have a background that's rooted in the IP's lore. There is a new god in town in Avowed, a god that we hadn't heard about before in previous Pillars games. And this is precisely the type of thing that usually comes with a big fat side order of bullshit, because you can't come up with a new god just like that, can you? And you do get a bullshit explanation in Avowed, one that seeks to justify the very simple fact that we hadn't heard about this god before because the writers simply hadn't thought about it before either. Like we said earlier, nature godlike were supposed to be blessed by Galawain, and it's more or less understood that each god has his or her personal touch. So now we are expected to be okay with the fact that nature godlikes may be the product of either Galawain's or Sapadal's intervention. But if I'm honest with you, I bought it. Kinda. In fact, the explanation about why we hadn't heard about this god before was one of the best things about the story in Avowed, in my opinion. It's still a bullshit explanation, of course, and I still think they should have ditched this idea, but they decided to go down that road, and I think they made the most out of it. Now on to the story. Well, as it happens with everything else in this game, the writing is insultingly handholdy and it treats you like a complete retard all the time. And this happens from the very get-go. I showed this game over on CBS, a most illustrious event that we have every Saturday on Discord, and we were literally pointing and laughing at everything this Orlan motherfucker had to say. We even named him Captain Obvious.
Those boards up there look old. A good hit and we can be on our way. Take that mess. It's no good to any of our crew anymore. Tripwire! Surely there's a way to clear those brambles. Ah, up there. Margarine's Fury. That'll do it. Burn right through the brush. If we can get it down, that is. There's an idea. We could shoot the Fury down. How's your aim? We do hope there's a fire spell in there. It'd make quick work of the brambles.
Jesus fucking Christ, game. Do you consider me so fucking retarded that I cannot figure this simple shit out myself? He also went on to say this.
The Deering soldiers don't blast into each other. They just don't.
Unlike other soldiers from other armies, you know? They kill each other in droves. The Orlan fucker also comments on the state of the soldiers, and it feels like everything he says to make sure that you are getting it, that you are piecing together the clues the way you are supposed to. And it's like this all the way through to the end. Even if you turn off every visual and audio cue to turn the experience into something a little bit more immersive and challenging, to try and figure out shit by yourself, your idiotic companions are always telling you what you should be looking at and what you should be doing about everything. Every time you enter a location where there's a quest item, they will tell you that there is a quest item and that you have to look at it. Every time you finish a dialogue with an NPC that requires you to go to a certain place, they will summarize the conversation by telling you where to go and how to get there the quickest. Despite the fact that you have a big fat quest marker that you can only partially disable, giving you that same information. Every time there's a world-changing decision to be made, everyone will explain in detail what the consequences are going to be. Even long-term consequences that should be pretty difficult to predict for everyone. And if you think that piece of dialogue with the Orlan was bad, allow me to present you this moment.
Mind spoilers coming your way.
So by this point in the game, you already know that the voice in your head belongs to Sabadal, the god of the living lands. She has already told you that if you want her help to stop the Dream Scourge, you need to find her prison and release her from it. So after like 5 or 6 conversations with several different NPCs about the probable location of this prison, your companion Kai makes this rather obvious suggestion.
Or maybe that god poking around your soul could give us directions.
And then your companion Giata says this without a slither of sarcasm in her voice.
Ask for directions. Why didn't I think of that? Kai, that's brilliant.
You also have like a million waking dreams in which Sabadal talks to you about your past lives. And these waking dreams are some of the most bloated, boring, pretentious, and pointless pieces of writing that I've ever come across in a game. These dreams don't tell you anything new about the Scourge, they don't tell you anything important about the world of Eora, and they are filled with choices that go absolutely nowhere. They basically offer answers to questions that you didn't have. And I am under the impression that some of these waking dreams were trying to emulate some of the scripted moments that we had in the original Pillars games, especially the ones in the White March Part 1 and 2. But those scripted moments moved the story forward and they answered questions that we actually had. At some point I thought that all these waking dreams about past lives were building up to something like that moment you had in Planescape Torment near the end, in which the Nameless One comes face to face with past iterations of himself and comes to terms with who he was so that he can move on. But of course, expecting the writing in Avowed to deliver a poignant, thought-provoking, and awe-inspiring moments like the ones you had in Planescape Torment, is just about as ridiculous as expecting Disney to churn out something that even remotely lives up to any of their brand's glory days. These waking dreams are there to tell you a bit more about what Sabadal is like and about what the living lands were like before she was imprisoned, but it's kind of forced down your throat and it interrupts some of the most enjoyable moments in the game. Everything is over-explained, everything is bloated, everything is plot convenient.
Everything is sexist.
Yeah, that too. In Avowed, if you meet two people of equal rank, and one of them is male and the other female, you can bet your bottom dollar that the guy is going to be agreeable and docile, and the female is going to be determined and gruff, and often more physically imposing even. The biggest decision in the game is in your hands. Do you listen to the OP female archmage with confident demeanor and unbending will, or do you listen to the OP female steel garrote leader with confident demeanor and unbending will? You also have a quest or two that try too hard to mirror some present-day social talking point or issue, like bringing a shipment of illegal contraceptives to the headmistress at the Mermaid's Den. You can technically choose to rat her out, extort her, or deliver the goods as promised, but the game very decidedly has thought on the matter, and it has various ways of judging you for making the wrong decision. And of course, at least one of the usual suspects in the shill media realm says that this is the best quest in early game. I do have to give credit to Avowed for one thing in the story department. I was 100% expecting the main antagonist to go from inexcusable evil bitch to victim that we were expected to sympathize with because some higher powered forced her to do evil shit, to unlikely hero of the story without whom the main character would have never been able to save the day. Thank you, Obsidian, for at least not pulling this idiocy on us. I think the worst crime in the story department is that it gets in the way of the fun. Because there is some fun to be had in Avowed, it just comes to an abrupt, boring end every time there's a cutscene, every time there's a dream sequence, and every time there is a conversation with an NPC. And for an RPG that takes place in the universe of Pillars of Eternity, this is not a good thing at all. Companions lore-wise. You only have 4 companions in Avowed. That wouldn't be a bad thing. I am all about quality over quantity. But quality isn't the first thing that comes to mind when I think of these guys and gals. Kai is the first guy you meet in the game, and other than a walking tooltip, there's nothing much to him. His easygoing demeanor and his overall lack of personality make him utterly forgettable. And this is only made worse by the fact that he is voiced by Brandon Keener, the guy who played Garrus Vakarian in the Mass Effect saga. A guy who you genuinely wanted to have a couple of beers with, one of the best bros in the realm of RPGs, and one of the most interesting companions in the history of the genre, in my opinion. So unfortunately, you can't help but compare these two, and Kai is just not even in the same universe. No pun intended. Marius is a generic, grumpy dwarf who really doesn't like anything mystical, godly, or otherworldly. He originally joins the party because you hire him to do some tracking, but he doesn't have any solid reason to tag along for the ride after that. In fact, at some point he is very much against going to Galloway's Tusk, but he throws a tantrum about it that seems completely unnecessary. He could have perfectly said, "Go on without me, count me out of this one," because there was nothing at stake for him anyways. And by that moment of the game, it also doesn't feel like he's found purpose in joining you for the adventure or anything. Giata is an animancer who is unsure about whether or not she's following the right path to the right goals, and Yatzli is a quirky mage who is all about gathering knowledge and pushing her arcane talents to the limit out of curiosity and passion. And I would have never ever in a million years thought, telling by the looks of these guys and gals, that I would say that Yatzli is actually the best of all of them. She is the oversexed, chaotic little devil who throws caution to the wind and wants to be a part of something great. She's still mildly annoying and her dearie gets repetitive and irritating after a while, but at least I will be able to remember what she was like a couple of months from now. Also, the game is painfully lacking in creativity when it comes to your companion's quests. All of them are about getting closure from some unfinished business from the past. Remember in Pillars of Eternity how Sagani had to chase Persoc all throughout the Deerwood because it was tradition in Nasitak that, when a prominent tribe member passed away, someone from the tribe had to go looking for the reincarnation of that person's soul to tell them about their achievements and contributions to the tribe in their past life. Remember how that chase eventually led to a half-dead deer in the middle of the forest, and that you had to fight or convince the hunters that were about to kill it so that Sagani could do her thing? Remember how Heravius had a lot to say if you brought him along for the ride even though it wasn't his quest? Well, you can't forget about any of that shit here. Of all the variants of the getting closure from the past quests, Marius's is perhaps the only one that feels moderately satisfying to complete, but I wouldn't say it's memorable. All in all, they are not bad, but they are nothing to write home about. And that is painful to say of an IP that gave us Aloth, the Grieving Mother, Durance, Eder, Sagani, Maya, and so on and so forth. Companions, gameplay-wise. This is probably the most disappointing experience that I've ever had in an RPG. By now you probably already know that you walk about with only 2 companions who make their own decisions. You cannot order them to move to spots or take cover, you cannot equip them with gear or even provide them with potions or other items for them to use however they see fit. And their skills are reduced to just another tab of abilities, no different from any of your other ability tabs. The only difference is that your companion's abilities have upgrades that actually modify the way the ability works. But, of course, these upgrades aren't mutually exclusive, which seriously hinders their tactical value. Also, there are so few of them. Giata is a healer-ish character, Kai is tankish, and Marius and Jostly are DPS-ish characters. And you can use them to sort out some situations, but it's really not that different from using your own skills, except for the fact that they draw attention onto themselves sometimes. Some companions have skills that can help you clear obstacles when you are exploring, but you can't do these things just as easily without them, so this renders those skills useless as well. There are some people out there who say that this was actually a good decision by Obsidian. Not big fans of Pillars of Eternity, I take it, or of RPGs in general. I think turning companions into the worst version of a pawn from Dragon's Dogma was a terrible decision, perhaps even the worst the devs made for this title. Secondary mechanics and user experience. There is trading, inventory management, and some crafting to be done in Avowed. And I think all of these things are worse than they were in the Pillars of Eternity series. Pillars of Eternity's trade and inventory management systems were exactly everything I had ever hoped for in an RPG. And Pillars of Eternity 2 improved upon most of those things. You had a common inventory with no carrying capacity limit. You could compare every item you had in your inventory to what everyone else had equipped on them. You had not only tabs to filter things more efficiently, but even a text filter that allowed you to find things instantly. You had a little transitional shopping cart of sorts that in your trade interface that allowed you to properly assess how much money you were going to make, and to make last-minute comparisons between everything you were about to sell and everything every other character had equipped on them. It was beautiful. And it featured standard drag and drop mechanics. Avowed's trading and inventory management systems are certainly better and more user-friendly than the vanilla, non-modded ones that you had in all post-Daggerfall Elder Scrolls games. But they are still clunky and inefficient compared to the ones in Pillars games. There is no dragging and dropping items to their slots. You need to right-click and left-click depending on where you want to equip your item. Why? Oh, because of consoles? Fine, then let that be the system for consoles. PC users are used to using their mouse to drag and drop shit. Also, I understand that unlimited carrying capacity is awfully convenient. Not very realistic or immersive, but very extremely practical. I for one was okay with it. In fact, I loved it because in games like the Temple of Elemental Evil and the Infinity Engine games from the 2000s, I would never renounce a single piece of loot. I always went back to every location and picked it clean, and I felt like this system just saved me the trouble of going back and forth between locations. But in Avowed, you have this even more immersion-breaking mechanic of sending to camp. Sending to camp? How? How exactly does that happen? As for the crafting system, it reminds me of the Fisher-Price drum set. Sure, you can bang on it and make music, but it's definitely not meant to be a real drum kit, and it was designed for kids who still don't know if they take music seriously. First, there are no recipes, so the feeling of accomplishment that you get in other games from getting an obscure recipe from an obscure chest in a godforsaken non-mandatory ruin located in the ass end of nowhere, and then gathering the ingredients, reagents, and components that you need to make the item, all of which are precious rare in the world, is completely non-existent. In fact, some of it is nonsensical. Tree branches are one of the most important crafting materials in the game, but you never find them in trees. Never. They are always inside chests or in corpses, because people walk about with random branches in this game. But then you have stuff like cheap wooden branch type A, which is only found in the first region of the game, and you can only use it to upgrade your items a few times. Beyond that, you need not so cheap wooden branch type B, which you can only find in the second region of the game. But if you have enough units of cheap wooden branch type A, you can combine them to form not so cheap wooden branch type B. How? Aren't they supposed to be from different trees? How does this happen? This happens because cheap wooden branch type A becomes useless at some point, and all the effort you went through to collect it would be lost otherwise. But they should have found a more immersive, less idiotic way to deal with this, like some lumberjack guild or a wood trader or something like that. Also, much like you'd expect, upgrading items is reduced to a boring flat stat increment. Now, there are enchantments in Avowed.
Enchantment?
Yes, just as there were in the original Pillars games. And there it is, my friend. There you have it. The only thing in the whole entire game that involves a trade-off. These enchantments are mutually exclusive.
No way!
Yup, I didn't think they had it in them. As for the user experience, it's okay. Some of you complained over on CBS that the stamina bar was placed in an awkward place, that it should have been with the rest of your stats. I don't mind that it's there, since it's only important when you do combat. I do mind, however, that you have the same key for dashing and jumping. The problem is that if you use the dash key during combat, while you are backing away or moving sideways, it makes your character dash, but if you're walking forward, it makes your character jump. And I think dashing forward is something that you absolutely should be able to do in this game. You can do it in games like Sekiro, you can do it in games like Doom Eternal, you can even do it in Outer Worlds if I remember correctly. In Tainted Grail Conquest, it's a good way to close in quickly after an enemy misses with his slow attack. This design choice is decidedly bad, and the devs should feel bad about it. Also, if you use the highly sophisticated tactic of climbing to a vantage point and jumping in and out of cover to shoot enemies, there is a chance you are going to find yourself locked in a useless position when the auto crit triggers, and that's why I hated the auto crit feature. But I can take that as a part of the cost of being a cheeser. Jumping around and looting containers while you are swimming in third person can feel a little bit janky at times, but it's nothing terrible. Overall, secondary mechanics feel like they belong in a game that's meant to be a very basic introduction to the RPG experience, and the user experience was good enough that I didn't feel like I had to wrestle with the interface, but not great by any means. Sound effects and mix.
Another glorious battle.
I guess that's justice. Why couldn't he have just stuck to sculpture?
Hear us. Follow us. We would speak to you.
This one's mine.
Sound effects in Avowed have a decent oh boy and oh wow factor. Shooting things with my arquebus felt deeply satisfying, not only because of the oomph of the shot, but because of the nice little sounds that went with the reload animation. Also, every time I got one of those auto crit moves,
Next one's mine.
I felt like saying, fuck yeah, take that. A lot of people compare Avowed to Outer Worlds, which is a game that I really did not like. But one positive thing that has to be said about that game is that its sound effects and mix are almost up to par with the most sophisticated and busy first-person shooters. Avowed isn't quite up to that level, but it's still pretty freaking good. The sound mix is actually quite impressive. Avowed deals really well with the verticality, and that includes the sound design. Also, I don't think there was a single sound that panned the wrong way, nor a single moment in which I didn't know where the sound was coming from. Sounds get adequately louder as you get closer to the source and quieter as you get farther away from it. Steps sound differently depending on the surface, and I never experienced any sound clipping or volume issues, aside from some of the cutscenes which were a little bit too loud. Overall, very good stuff, up to par with the best titles in its league. Music.
Find you better armor.
I'm coming for you.
I won't let him through.
This is nowhere near the level of awesomeness we had in Pillars of Eternity 2. You get your generic array of musical fantasy tropes for combat and cutscenes, and while they are consistent with the tone and vibe of the game, I didn't feel like the music ever told a story. In Dark Envoy, for example, the track for the final fight of the game is an epic medieval fantasy piece, but it has a synthy digital sounding sequence buried low in the mix, as though it's trying to tell us of the true nature of the final bad guy, or the track that plays in the game's main menu in Dragon Age Origins that goes from beautiful and peaceful to dark and sinister and then back again, as though it were telling the story of the never-ending cycle of good versus evil. The best musical thing about Avowed is when a few drunken pirates sing some of your favorite sea shanties from Pillars 2. And that is, well, music from Pillars 2. I guess I can best sum up the music in Avowed as not great, not terrible. Voice acting.
Merci, Envoy. I'll make myself at home. Anyway, enough chat. I'm sure you have things to do.
I wouldn't worry. Still, if you see any new mushrooms sprouting up anywhere unexpected, let me know. Until then, look on the bright side. The Living Lands is filled with people and things that are likelier to kill you first.
As am I, my friend, as am I. It's all thanks to you, of course.
We can't thank you enough, Envoy. Thanks to you, we've been able to enjoy a peacefulness that we haven't felt in quite some time.
Peaceful's an interesting word to use, love. The Dream Thralls are exceedingly aggressive out here.
It's really hard to separate actors from the lines they have to say and the emotions that they are supposed to convey. But if we do that, the voice acting in Avowed is actually fantastic. And I am going to give a lot of credit to the voice directors, because not a single line of dialogue sounds like it was read from a script, and every piece of voice acting here is consistent with the dramatic intention of the passage and with the characters' emotions. Whether or not these emotions are consistent with the characters' personalities or with the situations that they are going through at any given time is a whole different story. So overall, pretty good stuff, I would say. Graphics. Well, for one who dwells mostly in the depths of the indie world and is mostly interested in games that go for $20 or $30, or games that have been around for 20 or 30 years, Avowed's presentation is simply fantastic for the most part. I loved how I could climb to the highest part of a city and take it all in. I mean the view. Take in the view. I loved how cities and settlements looked busy and lived in, how every ecosystem was vastly different from the others, and they all still felt like they belonged in the Living Lands, a place that felt like it had a personality of its own, a chaotic and unruly place, just like the goddess that rules over it and the people who seek haven in it. Each major area in the game has one big city, and city spaces are pretty good looking, but it has to be said that every main settlement is noticeably smaller and less elaborate than the one before. And the game's topography and architecture are in tune with the very premise of the living lands. They are complex, often weird, and just plain fun to explore. Character models for non-human characters were pretty consistent with Pillars of Eternity lore, and they looked amazing. Humans were a bit ugly though, but at least you get to wander about with one of the cutest ones. Clothes and gear for the most part are consistent with the location, occupation, and station of the character who wears them. Though most of the weapons you get to equip feel aggressively okay, even when they are supposed to be super duper epic. The UI looks fine and polished, though a little bit too modern and detached from the game's look and feel. I miss the days of immersive UI like the one you had in Icewind Dale 2, but I have come to terms with the fact that we'll never have those types of HUDs again, which is a pity, really. Graphics aren't perfect though, animations are mostly really good, but when you play the game in third person, you understand why the devs and publishers never showed any footage from this perspective. Your character runs, swims, jumps, and wields weapons like he or she had learned how to do these things just the day before. And walking behind a cascade brings back memories of the mid-2000s, and not the good types of memories. All in all, great stuff in this department, though there are a few hiccups here and there. Performance and stability. Some people speak of crashes, bugs, glitches, and other shit that I never ever experienced. Ironically, this is one of the aspects in which the game has surpassed almost all my expectations. At some point I was unable to use my electricity spell to get those electricity-powered puzzle contraptions going, so I had to resort to Giata's electricity spell. Another time I fell into a dark crevasse that I couldn't get out of because I was not supposed to be able to jump around there. And near the end of the game I just fell off the world, but that was pretty hilarious, so I wasn't even mad. I understand why many of these things might seem unacceptable to some of you, but I have been around for a long time and I have played many great games with atrocious bugs, glitches, and straight out broken gameplay. Avowed is nowhere near the worst of them. It has its memeable things here and there, but I didn't suffer any crashes, and there were only a couple of moments in which the frame rate got noticeably bad, but I wouldn't say it hurt my experience. Overall, not perfect, but not as terrible as some people say it is, at least in my book. Other considerations and final thoughts. Like I said, I think this is it, boys. I think this is the last straw for me. Over the course of the last decade, our favorite IPs have been taken in a new direction, and it's one that I do not like one bit. The latest entries in some of my favorite series are quite simply no longer for me. They are hand-holdy, they have extremely simplistic and shallow mechanics, and they trivialize choice. They seem to be the product of an idiotic mentality that looks favorably upon equality of outcome, and that's why no one ever gets punished or rewarded for his or her decisions. Also, their stories are on the nose and painfully lacking anything that's even remotely thought-provoking. Stories that seem to have been written by people who, in my opinion, wouldn't recognize a universal value if it punched them in the face. People who believe it is their place to spread the word of what is right and just and warn us about the evil actors of the world. And worst yet, to judge guilty anyone who has anything to say about it. And just like that tired old band that should have retired 15 years ago that you used to love, these IPs are never going to go back to what they were. They are never again going to hit the spots they used to. And that's why I am moving to greener pastures. That's why I am moving on to games made by people who believe in rewarding those who make the extra effort and sacrifice, rather than by those who believe in leveling the playing field so that no one feels left out. In my opinion, every second this mentality prevails is a second too many, and I certainly don't want any part in that. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thank you for watching all the way up until now. If you like what you are seeing on this channel, please consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell to avoid the usual YouTube shenanigans. Come check us out on Discord if you don't mind all the boomer talk that goes on there. I personally love it and wouldn't change it for anything. And share the video if you thought it was cool. Bye everyone.
You're excused. You can go back to playing video games.